Umamusume 彼女たちは走るために生まれてきた
And crashed like lightning upon the civilized world. The eternal blue sky calls to us to unite all the world under Tengri. Fuck! Come on! No! Go! Go! Fuck! Shit! I can explain. Umamusume is a game, a gacha game, where people take real-life racehorses and turn them into anime girls, and then replicate in the stories and careers of these anime girl horses the wins, losses, and injuries of these real-life Japanese racehorses. The only thing that's not accurate is the euthanizations. Ordinarily, this would be kind of a funny phenomenon, but Umamusume, the property, has proven itself to be committed to very in-depth world building. And that means every decision the creators have made with this world has implications. This is not one of those scenarios where you can just look at something that's kind of off and go, they're just having fun with it. No. Everything matters. For one thing, there are no anime boys in this scenario. There are no real-life racehorses who are turned into anime boys. There are no boy Umamusume. All Umamusume are horse girls. Horse girls procreate by having children with male humans. If the child is male, he's a human. If the child is female, she's an Umamusume. Sometimes, a human couple can give birth to an Umamusume, not unlike how two regular humans can give birth to a wizard in, like, Harry Potter or some shit. Also, there are no regular horses in this universe. So, everything that horses did in history is done by either Umamusume or a different type of animal that is not a horse. And while all the stories of Umamusume take place in modern Japan and follow race horses, the fact that regular horses don't exist begs a question. How did cavalry work? My name is Alexander Hill. I am a historical fantasy author, and my last video took a month to put out because I was playing this shit. And by shit I mean Kino, peak fiction. This shit is hitting me like crack hit black neighborhoods in the 80s. I'm going to go through basically all of history and explain how cavalry would have worked in the world of Umamusume. If you think that's a funny idea or you learn anything at all somehow from this video, this took me a long time to put together, so I would not complain about a like and maybe a subscribe or a comment if you feel so inclined. I am an author. I have books to sell. If you like urban fantasy or historical fantasy, or like Uncharted and stuff, that's there, and the link to buy it and for all the other stuff is in the description. But I'm not really here to talk about that. What I am here to talk about is horse girls. Now, you might be wondering what do I mean when I say how would cavalry work? And what I mean is I'm going to go through all of human history and talk about all the different kinds of cavalry that at least I know of, and sort of pitch how that form of cavalry would have manifested in the world of Umamusume. But for the sake of my sanity, I have to set a couple of ground rules. First, I'm starting at the beginning of human civilization / the taming of the horse. I'm not starting at like the beginning of the human race because the fact that Umas and humans are capable of interbreeding implies that they evolve like somewhat similarly. And that brings up a bunch of questions about prehistory and human evolution that I neither have the expertise nor the desire to find the answers to. I don't know if there would be Neanderthal or Denisovan Umas. I don't really want to talk about the Stone Age that much. While it's possible and probably even likely that Umamusume would have started their relationship with humanity from the inception of their species, you know, again, based on how humans and Umas are capable of interbreeding, I can't be asked to come up with a new reality in which humans from the Stone Age had access to super labor force with human-level intelligence in the form of Umamusume. So my second rule is that I'm operating under the assumption that the world of Umamusume, aside from everything that is explicitly said by the company that runs Umamusume themselves, is very close to our modern world. This includes countries that exist, people who were born and died, the eras of history, the results of wars, etc., etc. This is not an alternate history scenario. I don't have time for that. Where aspects of the world differ from ours, but not in an explicit sense, I will lean towards a syncretic version of events. An example of this is the existence of Christianity. The Umamusume in Japan venerate 3 Umamusume goddesses, and while this might imply that this goddess venerating religion is the dominant one, hints from one of the other scenarios on the Japanese version of the game have suggested that the 3 goddesses are actually deified versions of 3 horses from the 1700s who, due to being the ancestors of most modern racehorses, are held up as gods. As such, the 3 goddesses religion probably exists alongside or has a different flavor when combined with Christianity. The same probably applies to Islam, Hinduism, and any other major religions. Third, there is a really important distinction that has to be made between a world where Umamusume do not have riders and a world where Umamusume do have riders. While Umas in the stories of Umamusume have no riders while racing, the reason for a jockey's existence on the racetrack is different from a rider's existence on a warhorse. I won't be picking between the two, and will describe each era of cavalry warfare in both contexts if it makes sense that either context could exist. Otherwise, I'm going to take the context that makes the most sense for that era and for the goals of that type of cavalry. An example of this is European knights. The reason a cavalry charge works in real life is that a horse is a big animal. Combined with a guy holding a weapon on top of them, they're even taller. The size and speed combined is what strikes fear into the heart of a peasant. If an Umamusume didn't have a rider, they would be fast, yes, but they would be about the size of an armored human. I think medieval people would have rediscovered the phalanx a bit faster in that scenario, so I think in the Middle Ages it's more likely that Umas would have had riders than not have them. Third, war is a natural expression of Darwinism, but it's also an expression of the society fighting it. For the knights example again, if the Umamusume have no riders and then there is no warrior culture among the human nobility, since most of the fighting and winning the battles is done by Umamusume, which has huge implications for the direction of Western civilization. The West functions so well because the Middle Ages were a period where influence was shared between many powerful classes. By the Renaissance, warriors, priests, merchants, and bureaucrats held similar influence in society, creating the cultural dynamism necessary for the Age of Discovery. So it's important to me that Umas have riders in this context, so Europe develops its cultural technology at the same pace.
Iltam Sumra Rashupti Ilatim, Itait Belet Ishi, Rabit Idi.
Now, the earliest piece of evidence we have that humans had tamed the horse come from the Indo-Europeans, which were a nomadic people that came out of the Ukrainian steppe. However, the horses that we found around there that date to the period of time where the Indo-Europeans were confined to Ukraine, we don't think they were used for war. However, once you go out east into Central Asia, the Indo-Europeans figured out how to attach a cart to the horse, thus inventing the chariot. And this brings me to the question that started this video in the first place. How the fuck does a chariot work with Umamusume? At first I figured a rickshaw-style construction would be used, with the Uma picking up the front of the chariot and running with it. But, You see how there's more than one horse? So I can only imagine they figured out some kind of bondage harness, I guess, to get 2 to 4 of them on there at the same time. I guess kind of like what Goldship wears in her racing outfit. Anyway, having rigged up Umamusume to their big wooden carts, the Indo-Europeans would be the first steppe people to crash into the civilized world. As we're talking about cavalry, you'll notice that this is a perennial issue with the grasslands. While the Indo-Europeans were busy figuring out their chariots, other humans had been building Bronze Age civilization. These would take the form of large, walled, agrarian city-states in fertile floodplains. Most of what we're talking about here is Mesopotamia, and also a little bit the Indus River Valley civilization, which we can't read their language, so all we have to go on are rocks. But there's a book out there on this topic called Against the Grain that details a theory about the origin of farming and how there wasn't much free will involved in that matter. This book argues that no one would rationally decide to choose farming over hunting and gathering, given all the health detriments of eating one staple crop for your entire life. As can be seen when we compare the bodies of people who lived and died during very sedentary periods of time, such as the height of the Roman Empire, the height of the Egyptian kingdoms, against people who lived and died in times like the Dark Ages or the Bronze Age collapse, where people are much healthier because they're eating a bigger variety of food. So there's a chance that much of early civilization was built on enslaving entire populations of people and forcing them to work the farm. This kind of makes sense in how farmhouses didn't really exist in the Bronze Age, or at least in this period of time that we're talking about, in the really early Bronze Age. Everyone would live inside the walled cities, then go out and work on the fields in the day, then return back inside the cities. There is a non-zero chance that in this whole process, Umamusume were enslaved by the first city builders, who likely did the enslaving via their own Umamusume. But while these settled societies were prime real estate for the Indo-Europeans in our world, Umamusume brings up another question that would breach my ground rules, but I can't really ignore. If every society has Umamusume, since they can be born to just regular human couples, that means every society has cavalry. And I can't ignore it, because there are some obvious consequences to that. Fine Motion, one of the horses in the game, is hinted to be a member of the royal family of the Kingdom of Ireland. You may notice that the Kingdom of Ireland does not exist in our world. The Kingdom of Ireland still existing in Umamusume's world has huge implications, meaning it was probably never conquered by Britain. I've seen some speculation that maybe the UK never reached the heights of power they did in our world, but I think there would be a very specific reason for that. See, Ireland was invaded in the 12th century by the Anglo-Normans, who introduced heavy cavalry to the British Isles. The Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and Gaelic tribes didn't have very strong cavalry traditions before the French took over. But if everyone had Umas, everyone has cavalry. So it's likely that Ireland managed to defeat the English knights using their own Umamusume. So that would imply that the Bronze Age city-states also had Umas before the Indo-Europeans introduced them. I'm going to explain this away by saying that it took a fucking long time for saddles and modern riding gear to be developed in our real world, and that maybe the Umas that the Mesopotamians were working with were more akin to wild donkeys than war horses, or of a less war-ready stock than what the Indo-Europeans were using. Also, we haven't seen donkeys in Umamusume yet, if I remember correctly. I don't think it's insane to say that donkeys are also girls in this world, although that also implies that mules can't exist, because if all the horses are girls and all the donkeys are girls, I guess maybe you could, like, CRISPR one into existence, but it'd be weird. Anyway, the Indo-Europeans used their horses to conquer everything from Ireland to Bangladesh, and that's why 70% of the world speaks Indo-European languages. The Middle East is disrupted by the arrival of Indo-Europeans from Anatolia and Iran, and other nomads who have adopted Uma culture around the collapse of the Babylonian Empire in around 1600 BC. They found a way to attach the ancient version of a tank, basically, to 4 Umas at the same time. The Sumerians and Elamites and other sedentary peoples, in order to compete, copy this tactic, and chariots end up dominating warfare for the next, like, 400 years. During the course of this chariot dominance, I want to tease out an important theme when discussing cavalry warfare. The way people wage war is oftentimes a reflection of how the society waging it operates. While the first city builders might have been able to enslave massive populations, by the time of Sargon the Great, the guy who made the first empire in the world, those societies willing to free their populations and give them the right to bear arms dominated. As a general rule, societies that rely more on infantry tend to have less class inequality than armies who rely on cavalry, which are more heavily divided by class. It costs a lot to upkeep a horse and to build a chariot. I'm going to assume that similar logistical issues apply to Umamusume. In addition to upkeep for the Umas, in order to build a chariot and have the armor necessary, you need access to bronze, at least in this period of time. Bronze is made out of copper and tin. While copper is plentiful and you can find it fucking everywhere, tin could only be sourced from faraway lands like the British Isles or Afghanistan, which Bronze Age societies did have contact with, but it was kind of equivalent to us going to, like, Mars to trade for tin. With the dominance of chariot warfare from 1600 BC to 1200 BC, Mesopotamia and the Bronze Age world at large, including Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt, became extremely totalitarian and decadent. Chariots are part of this, but so is the nature of living in a river valley where someone can project power down the riverbanks a lot easier than over land. So the ruling class grows stagnant and lazy, relying on the labor of their Umas to win their wars. And that's when the Sea Peoples arrive. Out of the Western Sea, barbarian men crash upon the shores of the civilized world, stripping away the dazzling bronze facade of the decadent empires with their iron swords. Like a surging wave, they overwhelm the chariot fighters with sheer numbers. The Bronze Age collapse, I think, is one of my favorite periods in history because it exemplifies everything I love about studying history. But for the purposes of this video, I won't go into it much. I have an old video that you can watch on the subject, but basically, the entire Bronze Age system had gotten really complex and really interconnected, which meant it was also really fragile. So the entire system collapses over the course of a generation due to the decadence of the pre-existing empires and a bunch of other just unfortunate circumstances. When it comes to the changing dynamics of warfare during this period, one cause can be pointed to: the Sea Peoples. Out in Italy and Greece during this time, the people there had been developing infantry tactics because Italy and Greece are somewhat mountainous and chariots don't really work as well there. So if the Mycenaeans and Sardinians had Umas, I suspect that they would have been used for farming labor at best and maybe trained in skirmishing tactics, using their high mobility to harass enemy armies rather than hitching them to a chariot. It was theorized that Sardinia and Sicily, as well as Greece, were invaded by large migrations around the same time. While the Dorian invasion of Greece is considered to be a myth, there is evidence that the Mycenaean Greeks suffered several waves of destruction during the Bronze Age collapse. And Sardinia is theorized to have been invaded by the bell-beaker culture of mainland Europe, as plenty of artifacts from that culture can be found on the coasts of Sardinia. However, the further inland you get, the more the remaining artifacts represent the native Sardinian culture, whose name I'm forgetting. It's like Nugarit or something. It starts with an N. Nugari? I don't know. These migrations forced Sardinians, Mycenaeans, certain Anatolian populations, and other Italians to set sail for the Levant and Egypt as pirates, mercenaries, and migrants. In order to arm everyone in these raiding bands, the Sea Peoples turned to swords, and the general disruption of trade that came with the Bronze Age collapse forced everyone to find an alternative to bronze. This was iron, which was much easier to find, but much harder to forge. The adoption of iron weapons and infantry armies by the Sea Peoples proved devastating for chariot warfare. So, that's a lot of dead Umas. Although I figure in the world of Umamusume, Umas would still have a place as they are incredibly fast and strong compared to the average human, and maintain human-like intelligence. But the fact of the matter is that a mob of Bronze Age pirates could still take out any Umamusume. Nonetheless, as the Bronze Age ends, So does the golden era of the chariot. But Umas still have a place as we move forward into the Iron Age.
Welcome to the rice fields, motherfucker!
Cavalry as we know it becomes a lot more recognizable in the Iron Age. While the Bronze Age collapse resulted in a hefty decline of chariots and the rise of infantry armies, people couldn't stay away from the speed and power of Umamusume forever. See, while the Indo-Europeans of Anatolia brought the chariot, the Indo-Europeans of Iran had developed methods of riding a horse directly. Meaning a cavalry unit didn't need to be this giant wood and bronze cart that you hitched 4 Umas to. A man of middling means could mount his horse and be just as mobile. However, due to the lack of modern riding equipment, including a lack of stirrups and saddles, melee cavalry was somewhat limited in its effectiveness. So on an Uma, it would probably look like a guy riding piggyback with an axe. But I think Iron Age cavalry and Umamusume would be riderless in this situation, since the limited effectiveness of cavalry also limits their influence on society. Plus, with the weapons and tactics early cavalry were using, it would probably be easier to just have the Uma carry those weapons while running. They would have used javelins and axes to be hit-and-run skirmishers, since charges were incredibly risky. I think in both real life and Umamusume, this holds true. While Umas are fast and powerful, it doesn't mean much if they get impaled on a spear. They don't have the same weight behind them as horses, or at least I don't think they do. Without that, a riderless Uma is too easy to kill in a charge. And as civilizations that survived the Bronze Age collapse recover, armies are growing more disciplined. However, there's another form of mounted warfare that, in my opinion, would require a rider, that being horse archery. The Indo-Aryans out of Iran brought mounted archery to the Middle East during the anarchy in the wake of the collapse. But out of that anarchy emerges the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They are not the good guys in this story. The Neo-Assyrians managed to replicate Iranian horse archers and even start armoring them. I think in a horse archer scenario, it's important that the Uma has a rider, especially when armored. Shooting a bow on horseback is a lot harder than swinging an axe at someone, so I think it would be more realistic if the Umamusume were allowed to just focus on running and supporting their rider, while the rider could specialize in shooting from the Uma's back. Also, horse archer cultures require an incredibly masculine edge compared to most other cultures. Disclaimer: when I say masculine and feminine in the context of society, I am not talking about whether men or women rule the society in question. England under Queen Elizabeth was incredibly masculine, while many patriarchal societies have been incredibly feminine. The difference is in how the genders interact with one another. In masculine societies, the society at large has a masculine impetus that gives their men something to do. Like conquer an empire, keep the peace, discover the world, innovate on technology and philosophy, wage a religious war, or colonize a frontier. Meanwhile, women are granted greater freedoms in these contexts because the goal and aims of the society's men don't necessarily collide with the axes of power that their women enjoy. A feminine society has no masculine impetus or takes the benefits of a previous masculine impetus for granted, and so no longer devotes energy to that goal. This forces men to compete with women for the same spaces and axes of power within the society, pitting them against one another. This often results in an increased repression of women, since they are now seen as a threat by that society's men. This is why barbarian or warrior cultures like Sparta, the Mongols, the Germanic tribes, and the Iroquois treated their women so well, but stagnant societies like India, modern Islam, and late imperial China treated their women so poorly. I know there are a lot of tomboy horse girls, but I don't think that's enough to power an entire civilization, especially with the implications of Maya no Top Gun's existence. For any society that ends up conquering huge empires, I think it's necessary for the Uma cavalry in those societies to have riders, since feminine societies tend to not be so interested in conquest. Which is to say that if the Umas are the ones leading the charge, I don't think they would be too interested in conquest either. I also think that the principle of competition between men and women would also apply to Umas. When you separate Umas and men from one another on the battlefield, at least in the ancient world, their relationship becomes competitive, because Umas, with their speed and power, are able to sweep up all the glory for themselves before any of the men in the infantry can get a chance to fight. Whereas when the Umas have riders, the relationship is more symbiotic. As an infantryman, if you have a commander who's part of the cavalry, the spoils of war that your commander receives and the honor that your commander receives from riding an Umamusume might also trickle down to you. So there's less of an overtly competitive mire of toxicity there. I'll get more into this in the medieval part of the video, but it's something to think about. Anyway, the Neo-Assyrians and their Umas conquer all of the Fertile Crescent and commit horrible war crimes together, such as making a man grind the bones of his family into flour, building mountains of severed ears, and doing the Trail of Tears, but worse and like 100 different times. Meanwhile, in China, the Zhou dynasty are overthrowing the Shang with their Umas, as they are early adopters of horse and chariot warfare, since although they were probably not Turks and Mongols or Indo-Europeans, they bordered a lot of those types of people and so picked up on cavalry warfare. And the Indo-Europeans used their chariots to take over North India and establish the Vedic texts and the organization of Hindu society. If Indian nationalists ever stumble upon this video, my comment section will be inundated with revisionist history, but Don't listen to them. The Neo-Assyrians proved to be far too overtly evil to actually last, since they're basically just the Bronze Age Nazis, and end up being conquered by a bunch of different horse tribes until the Persians finally take over. Being of Iranian descent, the Achaemenid Persians have inherited their ancestors' love for Umas, and thus are able to conquer the whole Middle East with a combination of cavalry and good stewardship under Cyrus the Great. Although that does bring me into Greece.
I say unfortunately because, I'm not racist, by the way. I'm not racist at all. I'm not saying I hate. There's some good Assyrians, there's some good Mesopotamians, there's some good Babylonians. Of course, some of them. I'm just saying, if my son comes to me one day and he says, Pater, I found the one, she's the perfect girl, I want her to give you grandchildren, but she's from Assyria, I will sell all Daxi, no problem. I'm just going to take him to the fields, have him watch the golden sunset, pull out my Glock 45.
While ancient Greece isn't exactly known for its cavalry and tends to put a little more emphasis on the whole hoplite gig, the Greek city-states absolutely used cavalry in their battles, just not as much as the Persians. I'm split on whether the ancient Greek Uma cavalry would make use of riders or not, as there aren't really that many factors that hinge on it, but I think riderless Umas are probably the play here, given Greece's rocky and mountainous terrain. This is the point where I want to bring up the conversation about Umamusume discrimination. In the show, there's no sense of Uma discrimination at all, aside from the fact that they're kind of expected to, I guess, do horse jobs. That being said, this doesn't mean that Umas weren't discriminated against in previous eras. In ancient Greece, fighting on horseback was seen as a job for weak cowards who couldn't fight in formation with the phalanx. There was less honor in it. However, I don't think Uma discrimination would be very prevalent, even with cultural attitudes like what the Greeks had. Throughout the ages of recorded history, there has been more time in which cavalry is useful than time in which cavalry is not. Infantry resurgences are usually fairly short-lived before people find a new use for cavalry. And the fact that any average Joe could end up with a chud daughter kind of makes it a logistical nightmare to be racist against Umas.
Go to sleep, go to sleep, go sleep, little pig. Go to sleep, go to sleep, go get time for you.
I bring this all up because I want to talk about Athens.
You see, what if the Persian barbarians want to get your credit card information?
And their famous appreciation of women. Anyway, I wouldn't put it past Athens, who primarily fights with hoplites, to treat Umas worse than most places, although probably not worse than normal women, given the super strength and super speed and all that. But Sparta, I think, would love Umas, even if they don't really have a cavalry culture, it's all, you know, survival of the fittest. Plus, the Umas would be pretty darn good at keeping that 80% slave population in line. None of us are without sin. After the decline of classical Greece with the Peloponnesian War, you get some barbarians from the north coming down, talking about destroying the Persian Empire or some shit. Oh look! It's Alexander the Great! Alexander's Macedonian army was so unstoppable, not just because of good tactics and strategy by Alexander, or even the Sarissa pike armies he fielded. A good chunk of Alexander's success can be attributed to his Hetairoi cavalry, which is one of the first examples of heavy shock cavalry being used in Europe. There are still no saddles or stirrups, but I think Umamusume Bucephalus would have absolutely carried Alexander on her back. While the last vestiges of Mesopotamian culture are getting curb-stomped, let's head west a little bit to the other locus of classical civilization, Rome. I don't have much to say about Roman cavalry since Rome ain't really my wheelhouse. You can tell that my expertise lies in the Bronze Age and the Middle Ages, given those are the periods of time that I'm talking the most about in this video. But the Romans would definitely be riding their Umas. And this is also a period of time where saddles start coming into wider use. I always imagined Umamusume saddles would be more or less a child carrier, like, you know, the backpack where you put a baby, or if you're a millennial, you put a dog in. That way you can free up the Uma's hands to better balance themselves when, you know, they're fucking sprinting down the battlefield. The Numidians, however, of Carthaginian fame, I don't think would ride their Umas. Since the Numidian cavalry is made up of light mounted warriors and used no riding gear at all, to the point where they didn't even have reins, they just wrapped a rope around the horse's neck. I think it would be more sensible for the Numidians to just send in their Umas without riders. And that probably makes Hannibal's crossing of the Alps a lot easier. If we move east over to India, Chandragupta has managed to carve out the Mauryan Empire using a confederacy of Himalayan tribes that use a composite mix of infantry and cavalry, which I think would be a riderless Uma situation. The Han dynasty of China, and actually all the other dynasties of China in general, will have a tough time breeding horses for war. I don't really know why that is, but every time China gets war horses, they end up needing more, like 100 years later.
大师，有人在哭哎！同学没事吧？你在哭什么？上学迟到了啦！没有车去学校吗？带他去学校，来吧。
So I would suspect that Chinese Umas have a high death rate, just like Chinese people. Good Uma stock was so rare and necessary that the Han dynasty sent out an expedition to Fergana through the Tian Shan Mountains, the Tarim Basin, the Gobi Desert, and the Gansu Pass, before they were able to find superior Umas and introduce them into the gene pool. For context, this would be like us sending a mission to the moon in order to find oil. That's how incomprehensibly large of a task this was. But one of the biggest wars the Han dynasty ever fought was a campaign of total war against the Xiongnu Confederacy, who were a proto-Mongol empire, I guess you could call it. Like the other horse archers we've seen in this video, the Xiongnu were absolutely Uma riders. They might have been Indo-Iranians, or they were the ancestors of the Turks and Mongols. Probably the latter, considering the fact that Han China spent all of their civilizational fuel burning Mongolia to the ground so the Xiongnu would fuck off. China actually succeeded in completely decimating the land and forcing the Xiongnu out, but completely killed their societal vigor, causing them to collapse soon after. But let's leave China behind to shatter into a billion pieces and follow the Xiongnu as they try to find a new home. These Xiongnu, Huns, made their way over to Pannonia in modern-day Hungary and... Oh, Oh, what's this? Rome is falling. In 370 AD, a wave of Hunnic Umamusume stormed out of the Eurasian steppes, descending upon Rome in the midst of its death throes. And Europe burns at the hands of the Scourge of God and his horse girls.
Here, the horse is here.
I ride with a million warriors. I bring the enemy. I am the Scourge of God.
Assalamu alaikum. It is I, Ahmed ibn Fadlan, great medieval explorer. I have explored the world from the sands of Ethiopia to the northernmost realms of Europe, where I have met with the people called Scandinavians, and today I shall bring you a report as to their music. This is the word.
In the wake of the fall of Rome and the short-lived Hun Empire, we arrive in the true Dark Ages, which is not the same thing as the Middle Ages, as that myth is somehow still making its rounds. The period between the fall of Rome and the year 1000, I would say, count as the actual Dark Ages, if there ever was one. There are a lot of moving parts here, so I'm not going to touch on everyone, but I will touch on the people who I think are important. First, the Germanic tribes. While I can't speak to most Germanic tribes, the Franks, who would build the empire that would eventually become France and Germany, are said to have been a cavalry people from early on, meaning they absolutely put their Umas to work. The Ostrogoths and Vandals also made immense use of cavalry, with the Ostrogoths being the first to place more honor on fighting on an Uma than fighting on foot. The Byzantine Empire, the half of Rome that survived the Dark Ages, began to imitate their primary rivals, the Sassanid Persians, building up a tradition of heavily armored cataphracts who would have been Umas with riders, both dressed in either scale mail or lamellar.
You are wingspan, well, wingspan, this is the strong span, it's the Greek god, okay, Greek god.
Chariot racing is also a huge deal in the Byzantine Empire, so much so that the Byzantine political factions are based on what chariot racing teams they support. So Umas definitely play a huge role in Byzantine politics. I, for one, want to see blue Umas and the green Umas start a riot in Constantinople. The Arabs, meanwhile, under the Rashidun Caliphate, achieved much of their conquests by horseback, and prior to the dominance of Islam, had much stake in breeding strong horses. Out of anyone in this time period, the strongest Umamusume would be coming out of the Arab caliphates. Before Islam, Bedouin nomads already had a strong culture of breeding Umas, which had created a fierce and strong stock. They were stronger, faster, more durable, and smarter than Umas from other lands. Umas of the Arab caliphates would be prized above all others, kept well guarded from any who would try to steal their 9-star speed and 9-star long sparks. I say that in jest, but the Arabs would even start calling themselves the people of the lance, so they took this shit seriously. Back in China, during the Warring States period in Jing Dynasty, the stirrup finally comes into play, allowing Chinese heavy cavalry to make full use of shock charges and couching their weapons. This is also the first time that Japan adopts heavy cavalry and develops the role of the samurai. In fact, the whole concept of Umamusume is based on a samurai who loved his horse so much he wished she was his daughter. The Vikings, on the other hand, would have been a riderless Uma society due to their complete lack of cavalry tradition. But giving an Uma an axe and a shield would have made for one hell of a shield maiden. I wonder if the Valkyries in Umamusume gallop instead of fly. With the Anglo-Saxons having come from the area around Denmark and northern Germany, I suspect that the kingdoms of the Old English Heptarchy had a similar tradition of giving Umas swords and axes rather than hopping on their backs. And while fighting against Viking invasion, there wouldn't have been much impetus to change that. Meanwhile, continental Europe was being ravaged by the Magyars. I have a video about this you can watch here. It's East Francia, eventually the Holy Roman Empire, that will develop the feudal system that allows them to fund the equipping of heavily armored Umamusume and their riders to fight against the Magyars in the 960s, proving the effectiveness of knights.
He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
End the siege, bro. You are washed. Just give up. The castle is impenetrable. I thought so too until they left the front gate open. Rookie mistake, guys.
The Middle Ages in Europe are dominated by the feudal system, as you should know if you remember anything from your world history class, which in the world of Umamusume, I think would be a little bit more complicated. Here's the thing. In order to make an Uma, a man has to get another Uma pregnant. So in order to breed powerful war horses, you need a man specifically dedicated to impregnating Umas. Or Christian monogamy is going to have to get a little more flexible. But the first option requires a whole new class structure that could have unforeseen butterfly effects on the rest of medieval society. It takes too much world building. On the other hand, creating a culture where a man has a wife and an Uma makes a monogamous society polygamous, and this brings its own boatload of consequences. In Ibn Khaldun's anthropological work, he posits the theory that empires only last about 120 years. That's 4 generations and some change. Meanwhile, Western anthropology has posited a theory that empires only last about 250 years. I think both are correct. But Ibn Khaldun was writing from a Muslim perspective, and Islam is a polygamous civilization, or at least was at that time. I don't know how widespread polygamy is nowadays in Islamic countries, but back in the Middle Ages, Islamic empires, at least the elites, would have 4 wives plus however many sex slaves they could get their hands on. And meanwhile, the West is a monogamous civilization. Due to the competitive gender dynamics created from any kind of polyamory, polyamorous societies collapsed about twice as fast as monogamous societies. So the life cycles of France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, Hungary, and Byzantium, and other Christian kingdoms would have been drastically altered by polygamous cultures. So here's what I'm going to do. The Kingdom of Ireland involves Umas into its royal family. I think that's evidence enough to say that noblemen, at the very least, had wives and Umas both as consorts. And because I can directly point to the potential consequences of that and how that would alter history, I can make a more confident asterisk than if I introduced a new element such as a new class of Uma breeder, whose consequences I would be a lot less familiar with. So we'll say that Umamusume during the Middle Ages were integrated into the noble class while being bred for war, giving Umas in medieval Europe immense status and prestige that would allow them to become members of the nobility themselves. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, despite the famed strength of the Arab Umma, the golden age of Islam has passed as the Seljuk Turks, riding on their stockier steppe Ummas, conquer all of the Middle East except Egypt and parts of the Levant, dealing a lethal blow to the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert, and leaving Anatolia open for Turkic migration. The Crusades brought the European kingdoms who relied on the sword and lance directly into conflict with the Seljuk Turks, who relied on bows, meaning the Middle East became a battleground for foreigners using heavy Umma knights against light Umma archers. Additionally, a pattern starts to emerge in Islam as it enters its first dark age, that being the Mamluk pattern. See, Mamluks are slave soldiers that the Arab caliphates used as their personal armies in order to prevent nepotistic influence from infecting their courts. The issue is, though, if you're arming a bunch of slaves. That's the issue. Most of these slaves are Turks and other nomadic peoples captured in war, so most of them are horse archers. Ironically, while early Islam was the best civilization to be in as an Ummah, medieval Islam would probably have a system of enslaving Ummas alongside their Mamluk riders, as the Golden Age gives way to a more decadent civilization. So when the Mamluks get tired of being slaves, they would conquer whatever swath of the Islamic world they happened to be in, and became the new rulers. Then the Mamluks would assimilate to the sedentary society that was around them, lose their horse archer ways in order to live in luxury, Then they establish a slave army of horse archers to stop their nobles from assassinating them, and then those slaves would get tired of being slaves. Time is a flat circle. Anyway, the Seljuks become more decadent and are conquered by their former vassal, the Khwarezmian Empire. It probably sucks really bad to be a Mamluk Umma, even more than it sucks to be a Mamluk soldier, because slavery, as an institution, isn't exactly famous for its respect for consent, and that's all I'm going to say on the matter. The Khwarezmian Empire gets into power, they also become decadent and forget their horse archer ways, and then let's go check in on China.
How to say, I will demolish that hole in Chinese. 我要搞坏那个洞洞.
China in the Middle Ages hasn't really been keeping on top of their Umma game, even during their second golden age with the Tang dynasty. Because the Tang are so expansive and huge, creating a multi-ethnic empire, they found it easier to just hire nomadic Turks and Mongols to be their cavalry instead of managing their own breeding program. This goes great for a few hundred years. The Silk Road opens up and China manages to maintain a path all the way to Uzbekistan by hiring these nomadic mounted archers and their Ummas. Meanwhile, Chinese Ummas can just live simple lives of farming without charging into battle against much stronger Ummas and dying by the millions. And then the An Lushan Rebellion happens. I explain this situation more in my blood message video, which you can find here. But basically, An Lushan was a Turkic general who was having an affair with the emperor's concubine and decided to rally all the Turks in the Tang government to help overthrow China. The Tang dynasty managed to suppress the rebellion, but the war was so costly that the Tang couldn't keep control over China and instead just shambled on as a walking corpse of a government for another few centuries before keeling over and dying. China shatters again, and there's a few more civil wars before it finally comes back together under the Song dynasty, and wait. What's going on over there? Oh, fuck! Genghis Khan has united all of Mongolia, and yet another wave, no, a tsunami of Umma mounted archers crashes out of the Eurasian steppe. The Song dynasty cut in half, forced to flee south. The Khwarezmians, gone, reduced to dust. Tibet, crushed, the first steppe people to ever do it. Korea, annexed. Siberia, conquered. Russia, ground into paste, all except Novgorod. Baghdad, ash. And Hungary's next. All are united under the eternal blue sky of Tengri, trampled beneath the foot of Umamusume.
O people, know that you have committed great sins. If you ask me what proof I have for these words, I say it is because I am the punishment of God.
But then the Khan dies and they all go home and history repeats. The Mongols left in the imperial territories assimilate to the luxurious and decadent ways of life of the cultures that were there before, become lazy, and then are conquered by more vigorous people. As the Middle Ages progress and Europe rises out of the ashes of Rome, tides are turning against Umamusume. In the Battle of Agincourt, massed English longbowmen prove fatal against an army of French knights. The first drop in the bucket. The Scots at Bannockburn and the Swiss at Laufen prove that if foot soldiers can hold their formation with iron discipline, even the strongest Umamusume will fall to their pikes. The Hussites of Bohemia implement gunpowder weaponry against the heavy cavalry crusaders under King Sigismund, which you can learn about that in this video. And the Ottomans used their Janissaries as foot soldiers to crush the Christian alliance at Kosovo. People all over Europe are discovering that, with cohesion, footmen can hold off heavy cavalry, and Ummas, although still members of the nobility, are falling out of favor. In the Middle East, after the Mongols' collapse, another Turco-Mongol warlord descended from Genghis Khan out of Uzbekistan ravages the Middle East. They just can't get a break, huh? This time it's the Timurids under Timur the Lame, who's basically just kind of a mini Genghis Khan. And in China, a peasant, with the support of the secret White Lotus Society, rises to power as emperor of the Ming dynasty by revolting against the decadent Mongol Yuan dynasty and restoring ethnic Han rule. But cavalry isn't really a thing to bring back. In fact, anything remotely Mongol, the Ming wanted nothing to do with. This includes ethnic diversity, horse archery, the Silk Road, and general societal dynamism, although they don't have this as bad as the Qing.
Renowned medieval musician from the school of Notre-Dame, Perrotin. Perrotin, merci beaucoup de vous être rejoint à nous aujourd'hui. Ouais, c'est ça, va te faire foutre, gros con. Non mais là, hein, putain, moi j'avais des trucs à faire, hein, parce que moi, tu sais, j'ai une vie, je voulais pas être ici aujourd'hui à la base.
After centuries of it being so over, Islam is finally so back. After stagnating and being shattered into a billion kingdoms under horse archer rule, strong, stable empires make a big comeback in a big way in the early modern period. The Levant, Egypt, North Africa, the Hejaz, and Mesopotamia were all conquered by the Ottomans in a century, and they also pushed into Europe, threatening the core of Christendom for the first time since Charles Martel beat the Arabs back to Spain. The guarded dominions of Iran, which is such a banger name for an empire, much more than Safavid, even though that's what they're colloquially known as, becomes one of the largest and longest lasting Iranian empires, and is the first time that a Shiite government comes to power there, marking a huge turning point where Iran becomes a core territory of Shia denominations. They fielded elite cavalry from Kizilbash,
اما واقعا اینجور آدم ها، یعنی یه مش آدم خوله کش احمق کون نشسته، یعنی آدم یا مثلا میگه که آره خب حقیقت موسیقی غربی بود که در 99% شرایط اینا رو به پرده استفاده نمیکنن. میگه خب هری پارچ چی؟ Jeff Beck,
who were militant Shiite organizations and even featured a form of mobile artillery by mounting a gun to a camel. Although I think it would be a lot funnier if the Safavids mounted that boomstick to an Uma. As the Timurid Empire was destroyed, Timur's descendants travel south to India and founds the Mughal Empire, which is the first empire to unite all of India since Chandragupta, although technically Chandragupta's empire was like most of India because no one conquers the Tamil kings. And with that unification, the Mughal Empire surpasses China as the richest nation on earth for the first time in... Well, actually, I don't know when the last time that happened was, or if that's even happened before, because in most periods of history, China's just by default the richest country on Earth. Oh, also, 3 guesses as to what their army was mostly made up of as descendants of Genghis Khan and Timur the Lame. Europe, meanwhile, is experiencing a decline of Uma usage because the Swiss found out that if you bunch up together with a bunch of pointy sticks, knights can't actually do that much. And then the Spanish figured out that if you add guns to the equation, knights really can't do much. But the Europeans get creative. They start making new types of armor that can eat gunshots, but that gets too heavy, so they scrap it. They make armor that covers the front 3/4 of your body and can eat gunshots, so it's a bit lighter, and that sticks around. The French and Germans came up with the idea of giving the riders of Umas guns, and usually I would think that guns are easy enough to use that Umas would just go riderless for that, but the idea isn't actually that effective, and also guns are a pain in the ass to reload at this time. So functionality isn't calling all the shots here. So we're going to say that early modern pistol Umas are still running with riders and maybe also earplugs because pistols are being shot from their backs. This develops into the caracole, which is where a bunch of pistol cavalry rides around in a circle in front of a tercio. Because Spanish tercios require their gunmen to hide in the middle of the pike square when horses come for them, the caracole's logic figures that you can just ride around in front of the tercio and fire at the pikemen basically without consequence. If you aren't actually equipped to charge the gunmen, however, it doesn't actually work that well when they come out and shoot you. In the east, the Poles and Russians are trying something a bit different. You might know of the winged hussars, which were Poland's elite heavy cavalry, and in the early Renaissance, they were light cavalry that came from Serbia after it had been conquered by the Ottomans. And while the hussars were armored more heavily as time went on, they were still lighter and faster than most knights, since they didn't armor their umas. These heavy hussars proved highly effective as shock cavalry. Upon doing battle with the Poles, the Swedish warrior kings like Gustavus Adolphus realized that even with gunpowder, shock cavalry still works. You just have to soften the enemy up a bit with said gunpowder weapons before you do the charge. The English Cavaliers came to the same conclusion in the English Civil War. And into the 30 Years' War, infantry quality started to decline as more nations relied on conscripts rather than professional soldiers like the Swiss, Flemish, and Scots had. So umas make a big comeback as shock cavalry combines with firepower. Meanwhile, training and drilling is growing in effectiveness, so it wouldn't be insane to think that some umas were capable of operating without a rider, learning to shoot and use weapons by themselves. Additionally, the extra speed and maneuverability that comes from being without a rider is probably important to these new cavalry tactics. Because the cavalry is less tied to societal rank in professional armies of European empires, especially in France, where the nobility basically became pets of the king after the construction of Versailles, there isn't much reason to give umas a rider. Although at this point, I think cavalry might be a mix of riderless umas and those with riders. Meanwhile, China is getting fucked up by the Manchus, who happen to be a steppe people, so yeah, uma archers are still relevant. But the Manchus assimilated to Han Chinese ways real fast, since they were basically parasitizing the Ming infrastructure and used Ming armies to do most of their fighting while conquering China. And all this time, Spain has been gradually introducing horses to the Americas, but they've remained under Spanish control, at least until the 1680s, where the Pueblos managed to kick the Spanish out of the southwestern US for 12 years, long enough for the Spanish horses to get disseminated among the natives. I'm going to say that Native American umas haven't spent 500 years being bred for war, and as such, just aren't strong enough to compete with, the European umas or really be ridden at all. Although by nature of having beasts of burden like umas, it's likely that Native Americans were much more technologically advanced, especially in North America, by the time the Europeans arrived. Probably not quite on par with Eurasia, but closer than our world. Although I can't say one way or the other if having umas around would allow them to develop more immunities to diseases which were often transmitted via livestock. I'm going to say probably not. The Great Plains and southwestern Native Americans used their new Uma stock to develop guerrilla warfare tactics, master horse archery, and prolong resistance against American expansion a few centuries later. In South America, meanwhile, Brazil and Argentina are dominated by gauchos, mounted raiders, and land pirates that get around and launch raids using umas. I think the bandit nature of these groups would demand direction from mostly men, so I'm going to say that these umas are not acting alone.
Over here, gentlemen, you can see the cavalry. They're moving on the left-hand side. Make ready for the cavalry and fire! Very nice. Well done. Reload, chaps. Reload, gentlemen. Reload. Very good. Oh, my God! He just took a fucking cannibal in the head! Gentlemen! Oh, my God! Gentlemen, he fucking died! Did you see that shit? Oh, dear Lord! Christ, have mercy. Right, this way, gentlemen. Right.
Cavalry remains relevant into the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars. And I think that would have taken the form of riderless umas more often than not, since in the time of line infantry, cavalry charges don't really work too well, but you want something to stop the enemy umas from flanking your infantry. It's in the modern age that umas really begin to be more independent in their societal role. Without riders, they don't really need to maintain their symbiotic relationship with the nobility, but many umas whose ancestors might have been on the battlefield may still maintain that relationship. However, with the dynamics of line infantry, umas are no longer directly competing with the infantry, since the umas are focused on protecting the infantry from other umas, and the infantry is focused on actually winning the battle. So while umas and men are separated, they still maintain a symbiotic relationship, just on a bigger scale. Instead of an individual man and an individual Uma in partnership, it's the whole Uma regiment and the whole infantry army that operate as partners. I also like the idea of Paul Revere sending an Uma to tell everyone that the British are coming.
Enough of this heathen music! Get rid of these goddamn monkeys! Strike up, boys! Ready? This is a night for Americans!
Moving on to the 19th century, Uma racing started to get really big all over the world. But this is an area of Uma history that is far more well documented, and I'm here to talk about cavalry warfare, so we're gonna not talk about racing for the rest of the video. 19th century cavalry is divided into several types, those being cuirassiers, dragoons, hussars, and lancers. I think all of these varieties could get on as Umas without riders, except maybe dragoons, who mostly use firearms and would probably need a rider. This also lets me have a reason for the Rough Riders to be Umas with mounted soldiers instead of lone Umas. The American Civil War, while mostly fought by infantry, has a lot of cavalry involvement, and this makes me ask the question, if African kingdoms would have captured the Umas of rival tribes and tried to sell them into slavery? It's not impossible, but like, hear me out, on a cotton farm, on a cotton farm, how much does Uma strength really matter? You know? Did the Confederate Umas own slaves? As Americans manifested their destiny, Umas were used heavily in combat between the Western Native American tribes and the Americans, since the natives were kind of fighting Mongol style at this point. Cowboys, ranchers, and outdoorsmen in America who lived close to their Umas would form volunteer cavalry regiments like the Rough Riders, who were basically just Giga Chads who wanted a little adventure in the Spanish-American War. Although only the Rough Riders actually got deployed into combat. I like the idea of Teddy Roosevelt riding an Uma into battle in Cuba.
There are many men who feel a kind of twisted pride and cynicism. There is no more unhealthy being, no man less worthy of respect than he who either really holds or feigns to hold an attitude of sneering disbelief toward all that is great and lofty. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena.
Due to the lack of major conflicts after the Franco-Prussian War, European nations maintained their cavalry forces while developing more deadly industrial weapons. However, a lot of them thought war would continue to be fought with line infantry and bayonet charges. But the American Civil War had shown some of the first examples of trench warfare, which would become pretty relevant really soon. Oh, also, before I talk about World War I, Umas are quickly losing their jobs in the Industrial Revolution to trains, cars, and farming equipment, so racing and war are really the two major career paths for an Uma by this point.
Queuing for petrol. Queuing for petrol. Queuing for petrol. But I'm on a horse. I'm on a horse. I'm on a horse. I don't need petrol, cause he runs on carrots.
Oh, and there was a Baltic German from Russia who was a hyper-conservative monarchist and fought in the Russian Civil War before going to Mongolia and becoming a steppe warlord so he could slaughter thousands of communist soldiers under the banner of the Mongol Empire and the last Khanate in history. Just thought that was worth mentioning for a video about cavalry. World War I involves a lot of dead Umas on the Western Front. For the first few years of the war, the French and Germans try to fight like it's still 1870, but machine guns and new artillery decimate cavalry divisions. And within the course of a few years, cavalry is phased out from the Western Front entirely and only plays a role in less developed battlefields like the Eastern Front, the Sinai-Palestine campaign in the Ottoman Empire, and Gallipoli. Most Umas are likely retired from war and are mostly around for ceremonial purposes, yet again losing another career path to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the Uma race. Since the end of World War I, cavalry has drastically fallen out of favor, as Umas are famously not bulletproof while tanks are. However, cavalry has seen some usage in Eastern Europe, the Russian Civil War, the Turkish War of Independence, the Nazi invasion of Poland, the Italian invasion of Greece, the Portuguese colonial war, the Rhodesian Bush War, and the Afghanistan War. In these eras, mounted cavalry were often armed with rifles rather than lances and swords, so the era of industrial warfare is when I'd say it's most likely Umamusume operated without riders. This is also a period where Umamusume racing is big, and racing involves no human riders at all, so I think the idea of Umas running without riders just in general is the default assumption for people in this time. There isn't much of a cultural reason for Umas to have riders, as by this point, cavalry is more of a leftover of a bygone age than a catalyst for cultural change. Additionally, cavalry charges aren't super reliable, since a disciplined, drilled professional army is far more able to counter a charge than untrained peasants, and this period of history is basically all drilled professional army, even the conscripts. Giving an Uma a rifle and letting her run is probably the most effective way to conduct cavalry in the modern age. It's 1939 and you're a German soldier storming into Poland, and you see, in the distance, and that is the entire history of cavalry in the Umamusume world, as speculated by me, an armchair historian who, instead of prepping for the Taurus Cup, did this shit. So please, please God, buy a copy of my book if you like what I do here, so I can wail a little bit.